Denise Ortiz of MindBodyHealing.biz. Thanks so much for joining me today. As you know, this group that I put together on Facebook and on YouTube and on my website is available for people to get information that they need to get us through these sometimes chaotic and tumultuous times. Now, a lot of the things that are going on around in the world today affect us all and affect us differently. So I try to bring on as many different speakers and giving information on where you could get help from them, books you can read, videos you can watch, audios you can listen to, whatever suits you. Please take the time to look through my page. It's again www.mindbodyhealing.biz and see what I am trying to make available to help you through this time. And today I have a speaker that I think a lot of you are really going to enjoy. His name is Geoff Brandenburg, and he is a holistic coach, holistic life coach, breathwork facilitator, trauma recovery skills certified coach, and a trauma-informed certified coach. And today he's going to be talking about heart trauma and the broken promise of love. Now, a little background on Geoff. About 35 years ago, after becoming certified in breathwork and emotional healing, he created his business plan, which was Doing Your Work Healing Program. Now, he works with clients to address trauma and grief recovery, relationship and communication skills, and life transitions and spiritual growth. He guides his clients to take responsibility for their lives so they can achieve healthy individuation in their families and relationships. He offers heart-centered listening, feedback, and psychoeducation, as well as a combination of cognitive and somatic modalities that empower the clients to establish their emotional safety and learn essential boundary and life skills. And boy, do we need this now more than ever. He's available to do sessions on Zoom. His information will be seen at the end of the video, but it's www.doingyourwork.com, and he's also available on Instagram as well. So now I'd like to bring on Geoff so he could tell you some information and things that may help you through. Geoff, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Denise. Thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here. So you covered a lot of ground in your introduction already that I was going to explain. So thank you for that about what I do in the background. Yes, 35 years ago, I took a certification course in integrative breathwork for emotional healing. It was rooted in the rebirthing school started by Leonard Orr. And I learned a circular breathing technique that I've been using ever since. And it's a beautifully effective breathing technique, and it addresses trauma extremely well. Back then, we were dealing with birth trauma. This is 1990, so we'd had a decade in the 80s of much more, after the 70s of humanistic psychology, holistic therapies began to really wake up in the 80s. And then by 90, people were really starting to want to formalize new ways of approaching trauma. It became, after Vietnam in the 70s, trauma became much more part of the conversation in the country. So we were dealing with the birth trauma at that point, which was perceived mostly as your manifested spirit coming into the world and being born is painful. It was kind of like that level of trauma. Since that time, when what I'm addressing in my book, Heart Trauma and the Broken Promise of Love, is what is the birth trauma for one, and then moving forward as we develop as children, what is it that becomes what I call the heart trauma? So basically, when we're born, there is an expectation inside of us. It's in the heart, it's in the soul, it's in the body, the brain, it's neurological, biological, that our parents will respond to us, that they will be present for us, and they'll be able to empower us to become whole, healthy individual beings capable of love and keeping the human race moving forward successfully. That expectation, however, is not something that's talked about or even thought about very much, but it's inherent in within us. And one of the reasons I wrote the book, I did couples coaching for 25 years. And one of the things I saw over and over again was that when couples were arguing and they were just kind of really not able to connect, I would always hear these unspoken words. If you really loved me, you would XYZ. And that was one of the hardest things for another person to feel coming at them because it's like, but I do love you. Yeah, but if you really loved me, you would, but I do. You know, you get this very complex back and forth. And I would often address it with clients and say, do you realize what you're saying is if you really love me? And do you realize the person you're talking to through your partner is your mother or your father? You're really addressing the person who didn't show up for you through your partner. And that would often break some of the unconscious repetition of the early abandonment or betrayal patterns that all couples encounter at some point. So it started the idea of the book. And it's something that I've researched deeply in terms of clinical work and neurological work, that expectation is very real. It's kind of like, you know, when seeds rise up out of the ground, they expect to see the sun. Which kind of an odd way to think of it, but they do. It's like, I live on planet Earth. There is the sun. I will grow. I will get photosynthesis. Unless somebody steps on me, I will become this tall or whatever. The inherent blueprint of the plant in the seed, the sun nurtures that into its full expression. Well, we kind of expect our parents to be like the sun. And unfortunately, generational trauma prevents that from happening. And most families, there's a story I like to tell. I had a couple in my office and they had a little newborn, I don't know, 6 months old. And he was sitting on mom's lap. And the baby and I were like really zooming in on each other. And he was like Googling. And we really got into deep eye gaze and it was beautiful. And his dad looks over and he says, he never does that with us. I said, well, do you ever do this with him? He said, no, we're too busy raising him.
Interesting.
Very revealing moment about how people have children, but often don't really understand what it means to connect with them, nurture them, get inside their world, get attuned to the person, the soul in that body who's really trying to become their own unique individual. So the heart trauma at the deepest level is when we come into families where ancestral trauma, inherited generational trauma is in our parents, in their bodies, blocking them in a wide variety of ways. It falls on us basically to either codependently take on all of that trauma and try to problem solve it in our bodies, or break away from it and do a flight response, trauma response, and try to get as far away from it as possible, which of course creates its own problems. So my work is designed to help address people with, as they look at these issues, to become conscious of this is what my parents represented in terms of trauma, their heart trauma, um, where their parents did not show up for them. And, the classic American school of emotional development is get over it. Life isn't fair, get over it. And fair enough, previous generations, two world wars and a depression, hardship, infant mortality rates, diseases, those generations did not have it easy. And trauma was normalized in their lives. And it was, people just did have to survive. So with all compassion looking back, this is not intentional. This is not something that they're saying, oh, we're just going to mess up our kids. But that all that unconscious survival, trauma survival patterning that our parents show up with and their own inability to articulate emotions or understand emotional safety. Emotional safety was just something that didn't happen for many people in life. So we're breaking new ground, definitely in terms of trauma recovery and trauma healing. That's why I'm writing the book on heart trauma, because it's not a clinically diagnosed condition. But to me, it is the deepest trauma of all, because when we are asked as children to sacrifice our needs, and as we're learning to cognitively take in the world around us, as well as understand what's happening in our bodies, to look inside of our parent and then see their parents behind them and then their parents behind them, these are invisible forces that are present in our parents' bodies every day that we're growing up with them. So it's this landscape that is invisible, but at the same time totally controls our development. So what I see in so many clients is in their heart, they have a grief, a really complicated grief that because we're allowing the inner child to be important, because we're allowing individual development to become so important and doing so much to help people really recover from addiction, abuse, trauma, complex grief, complex PTSD. Um, it validating the grief and understanding how to work with it is a huge part of what I do. Um, so the broken promise of love, it's the goal is in working with clients is to empower them to keep the promise of love with themselves. That's in a nutshell, that's the work. So that means doing reparenting work to work with the inner child, to find the inner teenager and connect with them, give them the love they didn't get, work with the body to understand the shock. And there's always a moment when we're growing up as children where we go into shock. It's like, my parents don't know what they're doing. And then we cope with that in any number of ways, usually codependency, loyalty, going into people pleasing, or we rebel and push away the parents. But dealing with some of the deeper layers of shock and even terror that can form when, as children, we recognize that there's this huge landscape of trauma landing in our body through our parents, and that promise of love isn't even there. The parents are just struggling to get through their lives as best they can. And when parents are divorced, now you've got a total failure of love in the family, a generational trauma that it's just going to get passed down to the kids right through the nervous system, through the grief that the parents themselves don't know how to resolve. I was very successful in helping families stay together, which was a really beautiful thing. Ultimately, this work is all about keeping the family together and healing together. And on a spiritual level, ultimately, so that when our parents cross over, if we've done our work and really taken it off their shoulders that we can own our own, healing journey, take responsibility for the heart trauma that we acquired, they can cross over with more peace in their hearts. They don't have to feel like, oh, I messed up my kids and I was a horrible parent. It's like, no, I was unconscious and my kids picked up the slack and they're not blaming me. And so one of the things that happens with uh, heart trauma and the broken promise of love is an underlying feeling of victimization. You bring me into the world as a manifested spirit. I'm saddled with 3 or 4 generations of trauma that I have to sort out without your help. And my basic individual success is going to be compromised entirely or partially. And I might be 40 or 50 before I even discover how to live my own life. So this is one of the deepest elements of doing grief and trauma work, is that often there's a layer of victimization that's very hard for people to accept and realize. But let's flop over into another world for a second, the spiritual world.
Mm.
Karma, on a very deep level, is driven by victimization. The things that we do to victimize others, or the things that others have done to victimize us, we cross over unhealed. And that force of victimization perpetuates the repeated acts of violence and cruelty and heartlessness. So it's one of the things that I strive to address in a not direct way at all, but to help people evolve their karma so that they are cleaning up a mess without violence through very, very gentle self-recovery work, the sacred inner child, and honoring especially the feminine, especially women, because the trauma of the mother, like men suffer trauma because they're supposed to not feel, and to be tough, and to don't be a girl, don't be a wussy, don't have emotions, don't cry. We get that as boys. Girls are told to sacrifice to stay safe. Don't show all your emotions. Sacrifice for the family, have children, and give up your own identity. And do that to keep the man happy, so that he thinks he's doing something in his world that is really successful. The the deepest thread of trauma that I see is always with the mothers. It always is about the women and their mother and their aunts and their sisters, and the things, that traumas that women have gone through at the hands of men that they don't talk about with us as men. Women talk about it with each other all the time. But that thread of the wounded mother and how that affects boys and daughters is one of the threads of trauma transmission through the generations that I worked very hard to try to address, because especially for men, to with growing up with a wounded mother who can't nurture us and then set us free to become our own man, if we become mother enmeshed, which a lot of men are, then they go on to form a very destructive relationship pattern with women of promising loyalty, but they straddle that fence and they want to be independent and hide in the man cave, or grow up with the boys all the time, or they don't show up emotionally, or they don't want to understand how to nurture children. So acknowledging the trauma of the wounded mother is a really important part of the work I do to help heal that broken promise of love. Because on so many levels, when mom in raising children can't find her own person inside from her trauma growing up, um, lacks confidence in how she's doing with her kids, dad's not available to support her, then that mom isn't able to keep the promise of love that every woman I've ever met who has children always dreamed of keeping that promise of love. Always thought, I will do this for my kids the way my mom couldn't. And then so many women are unable to fulfill that promise, and it haunts them. And I've worked with many families from pre-birth all the way to college in supporting the mothers and really healing and helping the family become whole. So the heart trauma, to me, man or woman, the inner pathway of the healing is a very feminine shift out of survival trauma responses, um, which are, fight or flight, which is where we aggressively move, or freeze and fail, where we are mobilized and we can't take care of ourselves, can't act. All too often, mothers, due to just the constraint of how men often aren't showing up to co-raise the children, it's the burden on the mom. A mom's nervous system gets overwhelmed. And I've done a lot of work within the understanding the nervous system, the polyvagal theory, understanding what the vagus nerve is. There's the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. And the sympathetic is the fight or flight. And that's between our shoulder blades from the brainstem down through the spine. But the parasympathetic, which is the resting, healing, digesting nervous system, which is more the feminine expression of the life force, very often is severely compromised because when we are in a trauma response, the collapse of the freeze and fail trauma response is that the parasympathetic shuts down. We can't receive well. We can't respond to ourselves very well. We freeze up inside, lock up out of
Right.
terror, fear, or I'm just going to hide myself and be a chameleon so you don't see me. So often mothers become chameleons with their husbands, and they live in a certain kind of freeze emotionally as they're raising their own children. Well, if the nervous system stays in freeze for too long, it goes into fail. In the animal kingdom, Stephen Porges observed, I'm sorry, Peter Levine observed animals in the wild, and he came up with a book, Waking the Tiger. He was a leader in trauma recovery thought back in 2010, I believe it was. He saw animals in the wild. They fight, flight, freeze, and they shake it off. Animals shake off trauma. He was wondering why humans don't. But there's a fourth trauma response that he didn't see, and it's when the animal's wounded and impaired, and its life cycle, its life expectancy is shortened. Maybe they're about to die. So we have this trauma response of fail where we start to expect, we adapt to being less of ourselves. We adapt to hoping for less or doing less or living less. And when exhausted mothers who haven't been getting any empathy from their husbands, which is unfortunately a lot of the time, when mom's nervous system shuts down and she starts to prepare to get old, to lose her own individual woman, to not be as playful. So many of the women I've talked to, when they talk to other women, they're talking about, I don't want to be like my mom. I don't want to lose my vitality the way my mom did. It's the collapse of the parasympathetic nervous system. So, and then that happens with sons when they kind of take on mom's wounding. It gets a little complicated, obviously, but my point is that in doing the understanding the broken promise of love and fulfilling it for ourselves, we can get down in our own parasympathetic nervous system, do the deep nurturing, healing, recovery work. And I do circular breathing every day. I have for 35 years. It restores balance, resting, healing, but also it regenerates and it regenerates the brain. The mind in trauma, the frontal lobe shut down, and we're stressed, we're reactive, our brains don't see well boundaries, solutions, how to communicate our feelings. So all of this works together to regenerate for men that they can take care of themselves emotionally and not ask a woman to be their surrogate mother. And for women
Mhm.
to be able to set really good boundaries around self-care and raising the children and getting the men more involved. and starting to really find the balance point that mothers from other generations just didn't have, whether it was the 1950s June Cleaver, father knows best kind of, conformity to that 50s ideal, or just um, the sheer amount of male trauma that, especially like after the Vietnam War, that rippled out into so many families, um,
Mhm.
and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So and that's one of the things that women have been dealing with for many centuries is war and men coming home from war and those men not being available emotionally for the family. So there's a lot of generational trauma, like I said, that is landing in our laps. And so,
Yeah, because I think too, like you said, with the women, we're brought up in a, it started with the June Cleaver type of thing, oh, I'm doing everything. I'm cleaning in a beautiful, with my pearls on in my dress and I'm vacuuming and I'm happy and I'm just doing all these things all day long. And it's taken a while to move out of that, but I think women are finally starting to understand, hey, I can do my own thing. I don't have to be this. And hey, have the family become more of a unit where everybody has to contribute to the family, not mom does everything and we show up and take, right?
yeah. And in that participation, empathy is born. And this is really important for empathy for mom that she doesn't just sacrifice herself, and that asking the father to show up with empathy for mom. Um, it's just so true that so many men really do attach themselves to a woman as a kind of surrogate mother. I can't tell you how many times I've worked with women who have children and they say to me, I already have two children. I don't want to raise the third child in my husband. It's so common. It's kind of scary, and sad. So yes, when mom is empowered to have boundaries and honored and with empathy through the family, it's very healing.
Yeah. Yeah. And you talked about the circular breathing. Can you tell us just a little bit about that? Because that sounds interesting. It's something we can do on our own before we
Yeah.
get to see you.
Yeah. It's deceptively simple. It's a full upper body inhale coming up into the upper lungs, especially making sure you do a full complete inhale and then a longer, slower exhale where you don't force it out. And it's roughly twice as long as the inhale. And just get into a rhythm, circular rhythm. So what happens is you're talking to your nervous system with this kind of breathing. The message is, in this moment, we are safe. I'm doing a full upper body inhale. I'm not restricting my breath out of fear. I'm not contracting out of a sense of inherent danger. When we breathe fully, our bodies are vulnerable. We really open up all of the musculature around the throat, lungs, abdomen, all of our vulnerable spots. And then the long, slow exhale, it models the behavior, the breathing of somebody who's really, really safe. Or the nervous system isn't spending any time hypervigilant and looking for danger. It really allows us to sink deep down into the lower parasympathetic nervous system. So what happens then is you keep that circular breathing rhythm going. And typically, I have clients breathe into whatever issue they want to focus on, just like engage in it, be present with it, really hold it in your body. And then let that long, slow exhale just dissipate whatever tension or blockages or shock or whatever's coming up. After about 5 to 7 minutes, we're saying to the body, you are safe right now. We are safe. There's a hormonal shift out of cortisol and adrenaline with the fight or flight survival nervous system,
Mm.
or that's the more aggressive. In the parasympathetic, it's more of an adrenal and cortisol collapse and fatigue. So we're addressing the hormone system. And what happens is we make a shift out of those hormones into oxytocin and serotonin and dopamine. So the brain comes back online, the frontal cortex comes back online. There's more space in the brain. We're not chattering as much. So many clients say, I can feel my mind. It's just present. Nothing's going on. So you get healthy brain activity, and then oxytocin is the bonding hormone. It's the warm, fuzzy, loving, connecting, resting, healing hormone. It's what mothers exude with newborn babies. So that's why I'm saying this is a very feminine healing journey because the oxytocin is the essence of the bonding experience. So what I guide clients into is a deeply embodied feeling of safety and attachment to themselves hormonally. And when the brain receives that from the heart, that's where a lot of the safety starts to come in. We start to really feel safe for the first time in our lives. And it's really kind of profound. And from
Yeah.
people then start to really blossom into making better choices and healing the trauma responses.
Yeah. Because also, I think too, many people don't realize, they think, oh, trauma. Well, no, I wasn't in a major car accident. I wasn't, in a war. So how could it be trauma? Because they don't realize what it's doing to their body. I know when I would take people into an induction in hypnosis, by the time they were done, the thing that they'd come out for, that's the most relaxed I've ever been. I didn't know I could be that relaxed. They don't realize how much is actually going on, the trauma in the family unit, the world around them, their workplaces, how much it affects the body. And like you said, we've been living in fight or flight for way too long as an everyday habit.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, it's normalized in the family system. That's just how things are. So yes, it's a profound revelation, and I'm really glad that you can relate from your own experience of how powerful that release is into the safety. Which begs the question, what is trauma? And the clinical definition is any event that overwhelms our capacity to cope, which is true. I like to think of it though as when a force bigger than us takes our normal sense of safety and self away from us. Because when we look at our parents, the generational trauma that they're carrying is a force that's like a slow avalanche coming down from previous generations and landing in our bodies every day, a little bit at a time, through whether the parents are checked out or angry or controlling or unavailable. They're controlled by those forces, and they're invisible forces. So it's a there's other great definitions: too much too soon, too much for too long, too little for too long. Those are also great trauma definitions. Um, so it's a topic that after COVID, which was a collective trauma and an individual kind of trauma that was kind of hadn't been seen since polio and measles and chickenpox. Um, People are now wanting to be a lot more conversant, and so being able to present trauma in a variety of ways is really helpful.
Wow, that's interesting. And like you said too, especially for men, I think it's coming around more. I see with some of my younger nephews, to, yes, express your feelings, express your emotions. It's okay to cry, because that helps to relieve them a lot of what they're feeling, right?
Very much so. Grief is an emotion that people don't understand very well, just like trauma. People think of grief as death, divorce, disaster, something big, right? That's it. That's what grief is. Trauma is car accidents and hurricanes and house burning down or divorce. But the truth is, developmental grief, when our development is impaired by our family, the grief that forms is often hidden. It's not as obvious, but it shows up when we're in a relationship with another person. And it typically shows up in the if you really love me grief,
Mm.
you would understand me and make me feel safe, and you would have understood what I was trying to say, that kind of thing. Developmental grief can be really complicated. Codependency is obviously one of the major issues where we sacrifice our identity to take care of the family or another person. The grief of sacrifice often is buried deep down in the body. And so, how I educate clients around grief is that grief tends to move in one of two pathways. It explodes into anger or it collapses into depression. Once again, we've got the trauma responses of mobilize into anger, collapse down, and we lose mobility. We get depressed. When I can help clients identify the grief in their trauma responses, it's and whether it's anger or depression, it helps them start to journey into their heart and think from their heart, feel from their heart, and have more empathy for themselves and people around them. Everybody's got grief of some kind, and most people act it out or portray it in ways they don't understand. So, in helping couples resolve their communication, helping them have empathy for each other's grief was one of the strategies I used, and it was very effective. Um, one of the patterns I saw so many times, and what is so vexing for so many women, men are afraid of women's grief. Women's grief comes from the mothering experience, holding the family together, kind of being the emotional conscience, the nurturing conscience of the family. Um, and when women go into their grief in relationship with men, there's a lot of backstory from their mother, their grandmothers, their aunts and sisters about the condition of women in general, where they just the abuse that has happened. I often say to men, we don't have to walk around the streets worrying about being raped unless we're in prison. Women do. And so that inherent lack of safety is an enormous, subtle form of grief that women work with all the time that men rarely think about. So the developing empathy for with a couple around these grief issues is very, very important to empathy is the greatest tool we have to heal trauma. So when we can develop listening and empathy toward grief, it's a big step into healing the trauma patterns that we inherit. Um, So yeah, those two pathways of grief, exploding into anger or collapsing into depression, I use those as starting points
Mm.
to bring clients into deeper awareness. And then through the somatic breath work, once you get that safe rhythm going in the body, people can de-escalate from the anger and they can start rising up from the depression and starting to regulate their nervous system finally into a safe kind of heart-centered place. And then spiritual work takes on a much different level because we can actually receive spiritual energy when we're safe in our heart versus blocked up with unprocessed grief and trauma.
That makes a lot of sense. You can go on and be open because I know many people that were new to spirituality that I've met along the way. I said, well, I'm kind of afraid to do that because I have to protect this and I have to protect that. So their fear is coming from somewhere else. It's coming from a previous trauma that they have to work through to be completely open, correct? That's basically what they're working on. Well, I'm telling you, this is fascinating information, and I hope everybody's really getting a lot from this. So before we wrap up, is there any words of wisdom or any particular things that you'd like to leave with the audience to let them know what they can do to kind of help themselves along? In one sentence or less, no pressure.
One word or less, circular breathing. I cannot impart this enough. It is the first response to ourselves that changes everything, everything. It's self-care. It you're helping your nervous system wake up and recover. So I'll just say that because that's what I say to all my clients. Breathe.
Yes, yes, the thing we forget to do. How many people find, including myself, I'm like, I'm holding my breath. Why? Because I'm
Yeah.
working and I'm on deadline, and you just end up holding your breath so much more than you realize.
Yeah.
It's amazing. Well, Geoff, I want to thank you so very much for taking the time out of your day to join us here and give us some wonderful information. And as I said, everyone, his information will be at the end of this video, so you can get in touch with him, go to his website or his Instagram page. And let's all start working on healing the ancestral traumas. Let's make this the generation where we change the way, I mean, this is the major shift we're going on in the world, and let's do our part to shift even ourselves and within our family and to make everything around us a little bit better. I think that would help, don't you, Geoff?
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you so very much. I appreciate your being here.
Thank you
And
for having me.
again, my name is Denise Ortiz of mindbodyhealing.biz.